Hi, and welcome to this webinar and the introduction of Stuido. My name is Gro Lindstad, and I am the Executive Director of Focus, Forum for Women and Development. Focus is a Norwegian umbrella organization that consists of about 50 Norwegian women's organizations and groups from all branches of the society. And Focus coordinates a lot of the international work done by these organizations. And we've existed for 25 years. We've been working for a number of years on issues connected to women's economic empowerment and women's rights. And we've seen the world has developed a lot during these 25 years. One issue that has been associated with women's empowerment and women's economic rights is the word micro. Too often we're doing microloans, microcredits, and microbanks. Nothing wrong with that. It works and it's a good concept, but it's not the only concept. We have to look at how women are integrated and are a part of business and working life as a whole. And in doing so, we looked at how businesses are good at looking at business and human rights with a gender lens. We started looking at this when we started looking at Norfund about 7 or 8 years ago. And we looked at how they were supposed to report on gender equality to the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and didn't do so in a good way. So we started developing to seeing how can we, in a nice way, push this, and how can we also develop this. We hired staff who were fortunate enough to get, who were experts on these issues. And with that, we also became involved in meetings at the UN Business and Human Rights Forum in Geneva that happens every year. And also at meetings at OECD in Paris, where we had these discussions. The first time we had a side event in Geneva on looking at business through a gender lens, we were very surprised because during 3 days of meetings, this was the only one that had gender as a perspective included. Since then, a lot has happened. We've been involved. We've seen that we actually have developed expertise in an area where it was lacking. And then we hooked up with Norwegian companies, other actors, and civil society to see what is actually possible to do to develop a tool that can be used for companies and others when they are doing due diligence and inclusion of women and gender equality. So we had talks, and we also had the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs as a willing partner to fund the pilot that we are launching today. And we've also used the time, and we've traveled to Norwegian embassies in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. And we've had workshops in cooperations with the embassies, with businesses, Norwegian and national in the countries, and also civil society, to see what they needed. We've also integrated it and the work that we do with civil society partners in the countries where we actually work with women's organizations. And with that, as a conclusion, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, State Secretary from the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Marianne Hagen, who has, of course, also said yes to being part of this launch. And it's a pleasure to introduce her and say, Marianne Hagen, the floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to the launch of the Stuido. Let me start by thanking the organizers for the important work that you do on gender issues and congratulate you with the Stuido pilot. These are indeed difficult times. The COVID-19 and the measures to contain the virus have had huge negative impact on the global economy. Global demand for goods and services are down. This has adverse effects on job creation and poverty reduction. Even before the crisis, human rights were under pressure globally. Now, because of the crisis, these pressures have increased, possibly leading to more abuse and exploitation. This includes the world of work. ILO's latest update on COVID-19 and the world of work shows that 305 million jobs could be lost. Around 436 million enterprises in the hardest hit sectors worldwide are currently facing high risks of serious disruption. It is therefore imperative that companies have a clear policy to help ensure that they meet the relevant international standards and legal requirements. As I have said many times, the Norwegian governments expect Norwegian companies to be familiar with and comply with the UN Guiding Principles and the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises. The Norwegian government takes this very seriously. We will continue our effort in promoting responsible business conduct at home and in our international engagement. We have to consider what kind of world we want to have after the crisis, and we have to strive to build back better. The active participation of businesses and their adherence to responsible business conduct are essential if we are going to achieve a better tomorrow. All companies are expected to apply effective due diligence by embedding responsible business conduct in their investment policies and management systems. However, we recognize that there is a void that is not adequately addressed in the conventional application of due diligence. That is in regards to the human rights of women and the inclusion of the gender perspective. Now, some might ask, why is it important to focus especially on gender issues and women's human rights? Obviously, human rights are about humans, which include women as well as men. So why should we make this distinction and focus on one particular group? The short answer is because we know that gender-specific risks are often overlooked. Many of the methods that we use to conduct responsible business are not designed to respond to gender specifically. The gender perspective has simply not received enough attention in this regard, and thus creating an imbalance. However, I believe that Stuido can help tip the scale by giving us new perspectives and a practical tool to supplement the way we conduct responsible business. Last November, I spoke at the UN's Forum on Business and Human Rights about gender guidance and the Working Group on Gender Dimensions report. As stated in that report, women's contribution to the economy is often overlooked. Women are still overrepresented in informal, casual, and part-time work. And women are exposed to exploitation and abuse in global supply chains. On average, across the world, women are paid 20% less than men. Women are also far more vulnerable to sexual violence and harassment in the workplace. In order to address this imbalance, we must work to secure non-discrimination, equal participation, and a world free from violence and sexual harassment. The first threshold is to facilitate women's participation in the world of work, both through access to quality education and through flexible parental leave schemes and childcare opportunities. The second threshold is for women to join all sectors and industries. And the third threshold is for women to be present at all levels of business operations, reaching the levels of senior management and entering the board rooms. Norway is working hard to make the Sustainable Development Goals a reality in Norway and in the rest of the world. SDG 5 is about achieving gender equality and empowering all women and girls. But realizing the potential of both halves of the population is crucial to achieving each of the 17 development goals. To achieve the SDGs, we also depend on business innovation and investment through responsible business conduct. Stuido can be a useful tool for businesses to ensure respect for women's rights as well as the achievement of the SDGs. Of course, respect for human rights and promoting sustainable development is not the responsibility of businesses alone. All parts of society must do their utmost. Nonetheless, businesses that embed respect for labor rights and human rights in their activities and across value chains make a powerful contribution to sustainable development. Not having negative impact is a minimum expectation. However, I hope more businesses embrace the business case for making a positive contribution to the SDGs. Because gender equality is not only a matter of fundamental human rights, but also, as we know from Norway, it is smart economics. Most people assume that Norway is a wealthy country due to our oil and gas industry. An equally important factor is the value of women's participation in the labor force. And in contrast to natural resources, this is a perpetual source of income. We know that responsible business conduct is a prerequisite for long-term profitability and sustainable business. And we know that gender equality has proven to be good for business. For example, research by the World Bank shows that eliminating discrimination against working women could increase labor productivity by as much as 25% in many countries. A separate study by McKinsey Global Institute estimated that the potential benefit of fully closing gender gaps in the workforce is a staggering $28 trillion increase in the global GDP by 2025. The lesson that we have learned in Norway is clearly backed up by international research. Increased participation by women translates directly into economic growth, welfare, and sustainability. So let us work together towards gender equality, sustainability, and a prosperous future after COVID-19. Let us ensure that women's human rights, gender equality, and women's empowerment become more than aspirational ideas. Stuido is a step in the right direction, a useful tool to work towards the goal of protecting women's rights in business relations. Thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of the launch.
Thank you so much to State Secretary Marianne Hagen for her keynote speech and valuable input that we will bring with us as we continue this discussion. It is now a pleasure for me to introduce to you the Executive Director of the Global Compact in Norway, Kim Gabrieli. The Global Compact was established in Norway in 2018 and then got its office last year in 2019. It is fitting for Focus to have Global Compact as a partner in this launch, because the Sustainable Development Goals very clearly highlights the cooperation between government, private sector, and civil society. The Global Compact asks companies to align their strategies and operations with the universal principles of human rights. So in this, also business and human rights. So Kim Gabrielli is a man with a multitude of different roles and experience from both Norwegian and international civil society and UN organizations. Before becoming executive director for the Norwegian branch of the Global Compact, he worked for UNICEF for 7 years in many different roles as their political advisor, as their director of communications, and before coming to the Global Compact as their assistant director. He also has had roles working for the Red Cross in Norway and has been political active for many years. So if somebody understands what we're talking about here, it's Kim Gabrielli.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Gro.
It's a pleasure having you here, and I'll give the floor to you.
Thanks a lot. So for us, it's important to start it out with saying that better gender equality means better business. What do the UN Global Compact mean by that? First of all, of course, we are talking about a principle approach. So our principles, the 10 principles for responsible business. But of course, as well, we do know that if you're going to reach the Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, we need to create good solutions in business, and then women are key. We already know that it's a good business if you look at numbers both from the World Economic Forum and others, that there is a key a connection between hiring female leaders and the economic growth of a company. But today, of course, we are going to talk about how can we put it into action. How do we make the principles concrete? So for us in the UN Global Compact, it's a pleasure, of course, working with UN Women, Focus in this case, and the approach we have taken to the work on empowering women is to set up the 7 women's empowerment principles together with UN Women. And of course, sometimes people tend to talk about women like there is a minority or just a small part of the world. But as the Chinese say, women are holding half the sky, of course, because they are half of the population. So talk about women as microeconomics or microfinance, like Gro said earlier today, it's of course not an option. Women are, just as the men are, macroeconomics. We need to get all of them into work, and we need to get all of them engaged in creating the business of tomorrow. So it's on one side, it's both a moral imperative, but it's also good for business, as reaching the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, are in general. So behind me you can see all the 7 principles, but of course that are what they are. They are principles. So how do we put them into practice? How do we make sure that companies use this in their everyday work? And that is one of the most challenging parts of this, of course. We want them to hire more female leaders, also in the Norwegian context, where only 6 of the 100 largest companies have a female CEO. But of course, we don't have all the best tools in the world to do the principles, and nobody has. It's only the companies themselves that can actually do this. But today, in this partnership with Focus and the ministry as well, we do have a concrete tool that can help us take 1 or 2 steps in the right direction. And as I said, we are completely dependent on the work that the companies do, and we are proud to have more than 11,000 companies with us in the world, 190 members soon in the Norwegian context, and it will be our role to bring this tool into Norwegian business society. So it's a pleasure for us to work closely with both Focus and others, and of course with the tool Stuido. And as I started out, better gender equality means better business.
Thank you so much, Kim, for being here and for contributing. And I can only say one thing. This is the start of a good partnership. And I look forward to continuing this. And I'm so happy that you're joining us for this webinar.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you. So we will continue, and the next person who is going to be speaking is my good colleague Per Bondevik, who is the staff member with Focus who is now in charge of working on Stuido. Per has brought with him to Focus more than 20 years experience and working in 20 countries on human rights, on businesses, on ethics, and important issues that he also brought with him into working on a gendered perspective. Per is going to explain more to you about Stuido in detail, and it gives me pleasure. Per.
Many thanks, Gro, for a kind introduction.
And I give the floor to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here, finally, to share the Stuido with all of you. Stuido, the name refers to due diligence, and of course, women. Throughout this work, we have been standing on the shoulders of the cornerstones of business and human rights. Not sure if stones have shoulders, but you get the point. We have the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, placing responsibilities with governments and with business. And then in that way, conceptualizing the frame and the division of responsibilities between those. We have the ILO, a well-known organization on labor rights, challenging ratifying governments to include labor rights in national legislation. And we have the UN Global Compact and OECD providing guidance, networks, and collaboration opportunities in promoting sustainable and human rights focused business. And not forget the Sustainable Development Goals, our common ambition to make the world a good place to live for everyone for a long time. Since the campaigns from civil society, 80s, late 90s, we saw the multi-stakeholder initiatives popping up in the 2000s, and now, lately, there has been a growing trend of enacting business relation to human rights in legislation. Many of these focus on businesses' responsibility to have a systematic approach to understanding how they impact human rights of others, and then report on that. Of course, of particular interest for us is the work on the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, the Gender Lens report last year, as well as the ILO New Convention on Violence and Harassment that also was approved in 2019. Now, of course, the work will be around the world to see how this will be ratified and translated into national legislation and regulations. In all of this, what I refer to, discrimination and gender is included in a way. Not always very specifically, but it's there. One question, of course, which I guess all of you have posed yourselves since you're here, why do we need a gender lens on business and human rights? Isn't business and human rights enough? Women's human rights are just the same as for men, for everyone. But it's a fact that most of modern slaves are women. There are still a number of countries with no legislation against sexual harassment, and that do often, in most cases, affect women. When it comes to the labor force, we know that around 40% of the workforce are women, the paid one, not to mention the unpaid one. And we also know that less than a third of them are in managerial positions. So there is an inequality when it comes to what kind of position you have, means also what kind of power you have and what kind of payoff you get. Women experience business-related human rights abuses differently from men. The She Deal. In developing this, we have been consulting with business, civil societies, national and internationally. She Deal is a practical tool. So far in the pilot, we have developed guidance for 3 sectors, along 4 business relations, and based on 5 due diligence steps. The key question here is, how can business ensure respect for women's human rights? As Gro mentioned in the introduction, we have been supported by the Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs in this process, and we've been happy to work with Iterate on the technical solution. In the pilot version, She Deal is free for everyone to use. You just log in, sign in with your email, and then you're ready to go. The way we organize this is based on the OECD guidelines for human rights due diligence. It should be fairly well known to everyone, although different models maybe appear around, but it's about the basics. First, you have to decide this is something we want to do. Step 1, embed responsible business conduct and commit. Step 2, you need to know what it looks like identify and assess, address actual and potential adverse impact you might have on women's human rights in your operations. And then integrate it into your policies, your practices, your risk management systems. Step 4, track. What is the outcome? What happens? Is there any changes? And then, of course, talk about it, communicate what you do, share with others, learn from each other. When you look through a brief page on that one, you're ready to commit and proceed. As I mentioned, we have in this pilot version 3 sectors, and they're not chosen by a coincidence. Agriculture, garment and footwear, extractive industries. Sectors where women constitute the majority often of the workforce. For instance, in countries like Cambodia and Bangladesh, in the garment sector, women represent 70 to 90% of the workforce. In extractive industries, we know there are risks related to influx of migrant male workers, often when in construction periods, where the incidence of rapes and sexual harassments tend to go up in nearby communities. Agriculture is also a sector with a lot of seasonal work, placing also a role in this picture for recruiters and an additional thing to look out for. 4 business relations have we framed it and coined it in She Deal. 1, of course, is your own staff, being it head office, being it branches, could be locally, could be globally, could be in many sites. That's one obvious arena for where you can apply the She Deal. Subcontractors or suppliers, as we've called it in the garment and agriculture sectors, those you're hiring to do stuff for you, or you're buying the products. Could be direct suppliers, indirect suppliers. But as we know from the UN Guiding Principles and also the guidelines, and to an increasing extent also expectations from consumers, as a business you have a responsibility for acting in a way that does not contribute to human rights abuses and breaches in your subcontractors or suppliers. It's rather the other way around. The way you act might contribute to or facilitate a situation of good working conditions. with those you deal with. Agents, recruiters and facilitators, their role might vary from one sector to another. Typical cases are day workers, short-time laborers, seasonal, where there is an agent who are providing labor force to a plantation, to a working site. Could also be agents who are the intermediate between you and the producing sites in commodities. We've also chosen to include external stakeholders here. As you know, that could be basically everyone, but it's also communities surrounding production sites, surrounding construction sites where the actions you do might have impact on the environment, on the use of water, could be the situation for women, sexual abuse, etc. That's also important to take into account. As you can see on the right-hand side here, there are indicators on the progress. And you can choose if you want to look only at directly employed to start somewhere, then you unclick the applicable buttons under there, under the applicable heading. So it's a possibility, as I will show you, to do this in steps. Here is a example case from Bolivia, extractive industries. As you see from the slide, the 4 steps in the model are reflected here. It's assess, integrate and act, track, communicate. You also see that there is a progress indicator reflecting all the steps that you have ticked off as in progress, and also the ones you have chosen to be not applicable. Using the function of not applicable can be useful in prioritizing. Does not necessarily mean that they're not applicable, but it gives you the opportunity to focus and do things in sequence. If you hit the plus button, in this case from assess, a new window open. And now we're really getting closer to the real content of this. Under each step, there is a list of tasks to carry out. In this case, we've gone into assess. And one of the key tasks here is map contextual risk. Under each task, you also see key checkpoints. And that's where you get really into the details. As you can see from this picture, we've chosen map contextual risk and analyze government relations as applicable, while reviewing our own policy, we've chosen not applicable. This is just for showing the flexibility in the model that you can use. If we enter key checkpoints, you will find a list of bullet points, left-hand side, and those will vary according to in each case, each checkpoint. So these are tailored to give you some food for thought, some challenges, some issues to look into under each task. The notes field is where you put your own comments, your own targets, your own things to do. So this is your list. And after having saved that, you will be able to retrieve it in the final report. We've left it as an open text field, giving you all the flexibility to use it in the way you want. And as I mentioned, you could put targets there, you could put to-dos for yourself, for others, etc. And the whole model, in all the different steps and all the actions, you will find exactly the same way of using it. It's built up in the same way. Finally here, we have produced also a simple report in Excel. There's no colors there, no formats, but you get all the information out. The SHE deal. In developing this, we have been consulting with business, civil societies, national and internationally. Stuido is a practical tool. So far in the pilot, we have developed guidance for 3 sectors along 4 business relations and based on 5 due diligence steps. The key question here is, how can business ensure respect for women's human rights? As Gro mentioned in the introduction, we have been supported by the Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs in this process, and we've been happy to work with Iterate on the technical solution. In the pilot version, Stuido is free for everyone to use. You just log in, sign in with your email, and then you're ready to go. The way we organize this is based on the OECD guidelines for human rights due diligence. It should be fairly well known to everyone, although different models maybe appear around, but it's about the basics. First, you have to decide this is something we want to do. Step 1, embed responsible business conduct and commit. Step 2, you need to know what it looks like identify and assess, address actual and potential adverse impact you might have on women's human rights in your operations. And then integrate it into your policies, your practices, your risk management systems. Step 4, track. What is the outcome? What happens? Is there any changes? And then, of course, talk about it, communicate what you do, share with others, learn from each other. When you look through a brief page on that one, you're ready to commit and proceed. As I mentioned, we have in this pilot version 3 sectors, and they're not chosen by a coincidence. Agriculture, garment and footwear, extractive industries. Sectors where women constitute the majority often of the workforce. For instance, in countries like Cambodia and Bangladesh, in the garment sector, women represent 70 to 90% of the workforce. In extractive industries, we know there are risks related to influx of migrant male workers, often when in construction periods, where the incidence of rapes and sexual harassments tend to go up in nearby communities. Agriculture is also a sector with a lot of seasonal work, placing also a role in this picture for recruiters and an additional thing to look out for. 4 business relations have we framed it and coined it in Stuido. One, of course, is your own staff, being it head office, being it branches, could be locally, could be globally, could be in many sites. That's one obvious arena for where you can apply the Stuido. Subcontractors or suppliers, as we've called it in the garment and agriculture sectors, those you're hiring to do stuff for you, or you're buying the products. Could be direct suppliers, indirect suppliers. But as we know from the UN Guiding Principles and also the guidelines, and to an increasing extent also expectations from consumers, as a business you have a responsibility for acting in a way that does not contribute to human rights abuses and breaches in your subcontractors or suppliers. It's rather the other way around. The way you act might contribute to or facilitate a situation of good working conditions with those you deal with. Agents, recruiters and facilitators, their role might vary from one sector to another. Typical cases are day workers, short-time laborers, seasonal, where there is an agent who are providing labor force to a plantation, to a working site. Could also be agents who are the intermediate between you and the producing sites in commodities. We've also chosen to include external stakeholders here. As you know, that could be basically everyone, but it's also communities surrounding production sites, surrounding construction sites where the actions you do might have impact on the environment, on the use of water, could be the situation for women, sexual abuse, etc. That's also important to take into account. As you can see on the right-hand side here, there are indicators on the progress. And you can choose if you want to look only at directly employed to start somewhere, then you unclick the applicable buttons under there, under the applicable heading. So it's a possibility, as I will show you, to do this in steps. Here is a example case from Bolivia, extractive industries. As you see from the slide, the 4 steps in the model are reflected here. It's assess, integrate and act, track, communicate. You also see that there is a progress indicator reflecting all the steps that you have ticked off as in progress, and also the ones you have chosen to be not applicable. Using the function of not applicable can be useful in prioritizing. Does not necessarily mean that they're not applicable, but it gives you the opportunity to focus and do things in sequence. If you hit the plus button, in this case from assess, a new window open. And now we're really getting closer to the real content of this. Under each step, there is a list of tasks to carry out. In this case, we've gone into assess. And one of the key tasks here is map contextual risk. Under each task, you also see key checkpoints. And that's where you get really into the details. As you can see from this picture, we've chosen map contextual risk and analyze government relations as applicable, while reviewing our own policy, we've chosen not applicable. This is just for showing the flexibility in the model that you can use. If we enter key checkpoints, you will find a list of bullet points, left-hand side, and those will vary according to in each case, each checkpoint. So these are tailored to give you some food for thought, some challenges, some issues to look into under each task. The notes field is where you put your own comments, your own targets, your own things to do. So this is your list. And after having saved that, you will be able to retrieve it in the final report. We've left it as an open text field, giving you all the flexibility to use it in the way you want. And as I mentioned, you could put targets there, you could put to-dos for yourself, for others, etc. And the whole model, in all the different steps and all the actions, you will find exactly the same way of using it. It's built up in the same way. Finally here, we have produced also a simple report in Excel. There's no colors there, no formats, but you get all the information out that you want. You will get a summary of which steps you've chosen to be applicable, which steps you're working on, and all the input you have saved in the notes fields. So this you could easily share, you could copy paste, put in your annual reports, share with other parts of the company, or etc. That was a brief introduction to Stuido. Hopefully it gave you an idea of what's in there, and it gave you also some interest and curiosity on exploring that more. The sharpest of you might have noticed a link to something called How Does Stuido Work? Well, basically Stuido doesn't work without you. It's supposed to make you work. To analyze, assess your own organizations. You can use it also to assess others, of course. It can be used in policy work. So the use of it is fairly open and all up to you. So we invite you all to use it, share with us, contact us, we'll be happy to help. And we're really eager to get your experiences on this one. How does it work? Is it useful? What would be the next step? How can we together help each other to ensure women's human rights in business? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Per, for guiding us through the nuts and bolts of Stuido and the pilot we've made. Moving on, we have partners who've actually been working with us also in other countries in the world, some old and some new. And we're going to have 2 pre-recorded video messages from them where they say something about how the tool is useful for them. Starting off, we're going to Uganda. And Irene Konga from the organization FIDA, which is the Ugandan organization or association for women lawyers, works as a feminist organization with women's economic rights and providing legal information to women. They have been using some of the tools that we've developed and have received trainings from Focus. And part of what has been happening with them is, due to their new knowledge, they've been invited into a partnership with the Ugandan government, where the government is now developing its own national plan of action. So without further ado, here's Irene.
My name is Irene Konga. I am the Director of Programs at FIDA Uganda. Today I am going to be sharing with you a few experiences from the work that we are doing in Uganda with workers in the horticulture sector, specifically in flower farms. Like in many other countries, has a patriarchal society, which means that leadership is seen as a preserve for men, and women and girls are often denied different opportunities, for instance, to education and skills development. As a result of that, we see that women tend to be overrepresented among low-cadre workers in the informal sector. On the flower farms where we work, we find that over the last few years, different flower farms have shown a commitment towards human rights, but they keep complaining that they do not have the requisite information and the tools to be able to put this into practice. As such, you find that, for instance, they are not fully aware about the place that women occupy within the society and how that is translated into the workplace. In a lot of the greenhouses where these women spend a lot of their time working on flowers, picking flowers and harvesting, as well as cleaning flower beds, they do not have the requisite protective gear that would protect them against the sexual and reproductive health repercussions or implications of being exposed to the chemicals in the greenhouses. A lot of the protective gear will be provided by companies, such as the provision of masks and gloves, but there's little recognition about the impact of chemicals, for instance, on the sexual and reproductive health rights of the workers. As such, you find that a lot of the workers complain about recurrent infections such as urinary tract infections. They have also complained that they have had miscarriages that they feel may be associated with the chemicals that they are exposed to. We also find that farms are not exactly aware of the different challenges that women experience during pregnancy. So within their structures and systems, they do not have facilities for women, for instance, during pregnancy that may have extreme morning sickness, and what that has and the impact that this may have on the work that they do. The peak seasons in the flower farms are between November and May, when we have Mother's Day. So because women also provide a lot of care for children and extended family members, you find that they often need to take off time when children are sick, and a lot of this time comes out of their annual leave. If they cannot take the leave because it's a peak period, then this nullifies what the leave is actually intended for. As such, it's important to apply a gender lens to help identify some of these particular impacts on women specifically, and then be able to address them. And we we also know that especially where a gender lens is applied using a tool such as Stuido, it has a ripple effect on the rest of the industry. It creates industry standards that suppliers and other business relations also have to adhere to. In terms of access to justice, in Uganda we have very high unemployment rates, and so job security is an issue, and we have found that this has been a major factor in terms of seeking for redress for workers. Because our formal justice system is also relatively expensive and relatively complex and adversarial, we also find that these workers who are usually poor and have limited levels of education are also not able to access the formal justice system in order to seek redress. And also we have found in the course of supporting workers to seek accountability for the infractions of human rights that sometimes these businesses and investors, because they are related to or are owned by powerful people and rich people, they are instead protected by some law enforcement agents, or they may be protected by certain officers within government. So this has made it especially difficult for poor workers to be able to seek corporate accountability. And in such circumstances, we have found that using complaints mechanisms outside of our jurisdiction is a viable option in order to access justice. We have been privileged to access technical support from Focus in terms of training for civil society organizations, as well as legal aid service providers and civil society organizations that provide free legal services on how to use the OECD complaints mechanism to bring actions on behalf of workers who may feel intimidated or for some reason are not willing to access justice. And so our partnership has been essential in terms of strengthening access to corporate accountability. We have received requests from partners who are interested in working together with FIDA to bring actions before using the OECD complaints mechanism. FIDA and Focus have a shared commitment towards integrating gender within business and human rights discourse, and with support from Focus in the last year during the development of the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, FIDA has been able to facilitate the consultation of rural and marginalized women on what they would like to see in the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, to receive their feedback on the text of the draft that has already been developed, which has been essential in enabling them to have their voices heard through this policy development process. FIDA, in partnership with Focus, has also been able to support the technical committee on the development of the National Action Plan, to convene technical committee working groups, and FIDA is part of this working group as well, to be able to assess that the National Action Plan is integrating best practices from other national action plans around the world, including progressive provisions, but especially making sure that the concerns of women and girls as workers, as members of communities, as consumers are integrated within the National Action Plan. I therefore really congratulate Focus on this achievement, and I know especially in our context where we have companies that are interested in upholding the human rights of surrounding communities, that this is an essential tool that is going to enable them be able to assess where there might be human rights implications from their business operations, so they are able to mitigate them and they are able to correct them. It will therefore add a lot of value to all of the policy advocacy work that we are doing in the country, and it will give companies practical tools that they can use in their bid to protect the rights of women and girls.
Thank you so much to Irene and FIDA from Uganda. From the African continent, we're moving to Latin America. In November last year, Focus met an organization from Colombia at the UN Business Forum for Human Rights in Geneva. The organization is called Fundación Ideas para la Paz, for short, FIP. They work in Colombia on issues connected to business and human rights and also work as a think tank. Their human rights due diligence coordinator, Margarita Pallejo, is going to speak about their work and how they see Stuido will be something they can use. So I send it over to you, Margarita, and you have the word.
Good morning to everyone. We're very excited to be part of the Stuido launch today. Thank you so much to Focus for the invitation. My name is Margarita Parejo. I'm the Human Rights Due Diligence Coordinator of the Ideas for Peace Foundation, or Fundación Ideas para la Paz, FIP, from Colombia. FIP is an independent think and do tank established 21 years ago that is convinced that in Colombia we will not advance towards a stable and lasting peace without active and quality involvement of the business sector. From a business and human rights angle, we have worked for the last 16 years in guiding companies from different economic sectors to implement responsible business conducts in accordance with the UNGPs, the OECD guidelines, and ILO and World Bank standards. This, of course, includes all the elements of human rights due diligence processes, from policy commitments to communication. Also, in the last years, we have enhanced our processes to include a gender approach, and this considering that women and girls have historically seen their rights impacted in a disproportionate way, facing multiple forms of structural discrimination and violence. We have no doubt as FIP that businesses should integrate a gender perspective in carrying out all the steps of human rights due diligence processes. That means identifying, integrating, and addressing negative, current, and potential adverse impacts on women's rights. I will now like to point out several common impacts on women's rights resulting from business or different business activities and operations that we have identified as part of our work. Firstly, we have identified barriers to access employment for women, strengthening their rights to a decent income and livelihood, and also exacerbating women's vulnerability conditions that based on gender. In Colombia, this is very critical since women unemployment rates almost double men's, even though women have higher levels of education. This is more evident in economic sectors with historic occupational gender segregation, such as extractive sector. That is one of the sectors that is prioritized by the Stuido tool. We have also evidenced cases in which women suffer sexual violence to be able to access employment. So this is a very critical issue. Secondly, we have found inequitable working conditions based on gender, such as lack of equal opportunities for women to enter leadership roles, health and safety conditions, and wage discrimination, where, for example, in Colombia, the wage gap among women and men is approximately 12%. And we also find a case here in a company where they had inadequate infrastructure to meet women's specific physiological needs, such as lack of sanitary batteries in the company's operation area, as well as lactation rooms. And this might seem a very technical and small issue, but this is important since it leads to possible health impacts and harms, exposes women to situations of violation of their privacy, and also generates impacts on the right of the equal treatment. And thirdly, we have identified other very critical gender-based violence, such as sexual exploitation of girls and adolescents, domestic violence, generalized sexual harassment or discrimination towards women, and this is increased or it's more common in economic sectors with large participation of male workers, such again as extractive sector. So this is a very broad view of women's situation in Colombia in relation to business operations. So I would like to mention now some recommendations from FIP's experience for including a gender perspective in human rights due diligence processes, but also in all business activities. And firstly, we are convinced that it is most important to companies identify and understand the internal and external context regarding women and girls, and of course, the impacts their operations can generate on their rights. And for this, it can be very useful to consult with impacted and potentially impacted women in safe spaces. And this means that understanding impacts from women's perspective will help to address them in a more adequate and inclusive manner. We also recommend creating and strengthening company gender-sensitive policies, and not as standalone policies, but that policies that integrate with all other policies, operations, and activities of a company. Another recommendation is including women in all decision-making processes. And this will ensure true gender perspective when defining measures, such as infrastructure ones, for example, to address impacts. We also strongly recommend to accompany all of these measures and processes with structured and meaningful training processes for employees and contractors, so that the measures the company is taking are reflected also in individual practices of company officials. And lastly, we recommend not working alone. It can be very useful to promote or include partnerships with women associations or with government offices related to women issues. So, considering all what I have mentioned very quickly, we believe SheDeal is a very practical tool that will help businesses to identify, address, integrate, and follow up the impacts and the measures, such as I mentioned before, and safeguarding the respect for human rights of women and girls in their operations. And mostly, we also look forward to using the SheDeal tool ourselves in our own due diligence processes. Thank you and have a good day.
So with this, we've heard from actors from different parts of organizations and also from different parts of the world. We're going into the last part of the launch of SheDeal, which is a panel discussion. And to guide us through this, I am handing over the mic to my colleague Per.
Thank you very much, Gro. Now I'm really looking forward to the discussion that we will have. We have been lucky to gather a good group of competent people from different sectors to hear their view on women's role in ensuring human rights on the SheDeal, and who knows, maybe they will even challenge each other on how to go forward. And now it's with great pleasure we will introduce you to the panel discussion and debate. And I'm really happy to have with me Ylva Lindberg, the Executive Vice President on Communications and Strategy in Norfund. Norfund is the Norwegian government's investment vehicle in developing countries. It has a portfolio of around 25 billion NOK, direct investments in some 30 countries, and do focus on clean energy, financial institutions, and job creation. Ylva has been around for quite a while, working on, first I guess it was corporate social responsibility, and then it turned into business human rights and strategies. She's been part of the Norwegian Pension Fund Ethical Council, and has a long and very interesting experience also advising companies on their strategies. So I'm happy to leave the word with you, Ylva. Looking forward to a good discussion.
Many thanks to Per for those kind words of introduction. And as Per said, I come from Norfund, the Norwegian investment fund for developing countries. And our mission is to invest to create jobs and improve lives in developing countries. And as such, of course, gender and women's rights is one of the things that's very important to us when we invest. And it's important for two main reasons. One is because it is the right thing to do, and the second one is because it makes business sense. And when we work with women's rights and human rights, we do so using the IFC performance standards, which really helps us guide in an operational way in very challenging contexts in some of the poorest countries in the world, how we can work with and respect human rights and women's rights. Gender is also a cross-cutting issue in Norwegian development aid, and as such is something that permeates all the work that we do and other parts of Norwegian development aid as well. Per asked me just by way of introduction to say a little bit about how we work with gender. And Norfund works with gender on three different dimensions. We do so in our own operations, how to promote diversity and work with gender and equality in our operations as Norfund, as the Norfund organization. Secondly, we work with women's rights and gender in our investees, so our portfolio companies, the more than 900 or so companies that we invest in directly, indirectly, or through funds across developing countries. And in promoting women leadership, respecting women's rights in operations and so on. That's the second part of our gender work. And then the third part is wider society. So seeing how we can both learn from others, but also be an inspiration and a role model on how to promote women's rights more widely. So those three dimensions are important in Norfund. Now turning to the panel conversation, we'll be talking about how women's rights can and should be upheld when companies and investors operate in challenging contexts in developing countries. And as Per said initially, 71% of modern slaves across the world today are women. And there are 65 countries that really lack legislation on women's rights. We have various tools, we have conventions, we have principles, and we have strategies, but we don't yet have the realities on the ground. Now, what will it take, and to what extent can SHE-DIL be a key tool in making that happen? Can it, as the State Secretary said, tip the scale? So I'd like to introduce our panel, starting here on my left, Frode Elgesen, who is the leader of the OECD National Contact Point in Norway. Next to him is Marte Johnsen Stensrud. She's Vice President of Human Rights in Equinor. Then we have on my far right here, Amalie Hilde Tofte, International Advisor in Industri Energi. And then we have Tulio Machado Helland, who's Senior Legal Advisor and ESG Analyst in Storebrand. Now, the way that we'll run this is we'll have some short introductions from each of them, talking about their key priorities and also how they might be able to use SHE-DIL in their own operations. And then we'll have, I wouldn't call it a panel debate because I'm not trying to to criticize or push these guys on challenging issues, but rather trying to have a conversation about the issues at hand and what we might do in practice. So Frode, I'd like to kick off with you. What are your key priorities in terms of gender equality and how might you use SHE-DIL? Please.
Thank you. I think I will start to jumping to the conclusion, which is that, in my view, SHE-DIL is very useful. And I think it's necessary. And it's useful because it is practical and it gives businesses a tool for really addressing women's rights and gender issues in a practical way. And it's based on the well-known standards, which is important. It doesn't introduce something new when it comes to the basic standards, but it develops or offers a tool for working with this in an important way, in an effective way. And it's necessary because there's a lot to do in this area. We know that in many sectors, the women's rights are threatened. There's a great risk to women to be exposed to abuse and discrimination and other violation of their rights. So it's necessary. And when I say it's necessary, it's also implicating that others are not doing enough. So, which also goes for my organization. So. It's a supplement and a tool that will increase the awareness concerning women's rights, which is very important, I think. That being said, the OECD system and the OECD guidelines is to a large extent concerned also about gender rights. So, I mean, discrimination is, or to be free from discrimination, is a human right in itself. And the guidelines and the guidances is addressing women's rights and gender issues in many parts of the guidelines and the guidances, especially when it comes to sectors like apparel industry, the extractive industries, and the agriculture sector. So, and on these in these sectors, you have in all guidelines concrete guidances on how to address these issues. So we are working on this, and it's a central and serious issue in our work. And we have not had any cases in Norwegian contact point yet, but these guidances will guide us if these cases come, which I will sure that they will. And then I have a wish when it comes to these kind of tools, and that is, as in other areas, concrete information about the risks on the ground is very important. So if this tool could be developed to also be a platform for sharing information about concrete risks on the ground, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Great, many thanks for the Marta, I'd like to turn it over to you, what you're doing on gender equality and how you might use SheDill in your efforts.
Thank you very much, Ylva. So Equinor's human rights policy was created in 2015 and is based on the UNGPs. And it sets out the principles for how we relate to employees, contractors, suppliers and partners, as well as communities. And the gender issue is a cross-cutting issue across all those groups. Now, we are committed to particularly be attentive to human rights we are at risk of impacting most, and to the human rights of people most vulnerable to those adverse impacts. And again, women and girls are a particular group of concern. Now, women experience business-related human rights abuses in unique ways, and they are often affected disproportionately, as we've talked about today. And women also face multiple forms of discrimination and experience additional barriers in seeking access to effective remedies. So therefore, we absolutely acknowledge our responsibility to give special attention to women and girls and to the structural discrimination and barriers that they face. So some examples of human rights issues related to women and girls that could be relevant to our sector. So exclusion from decision-making processes and consultations where access to land, compensation and benefits are negotiated. We know women often have lower levels of literacy and awareness of their own rights, of laws and mechanisms for compensation, and also how to access those. Also, lack of financial compensation for loss of livelihood due to formal and traditional discrimination in the country regarding women's right to property, inheritance and access to financial services. And as it has been also explored today, that the wages and opportunities for women are often a systematic problem, and that they have fewer promotion opportunities. So now we have been working very hard in our company during the last years to translate the policy commitment into practical work throughout our company. And SheDill is a very good example of a practical tool that can help guide us in our understanding of gender risks and how they can be addressed. And we have been proud to be a part of this development and support of SheDill all the way from the idea stage and now to the launch today. And I can say that we in Equinor have learned a lot during this journey. And for us, SheDill could serve as a complement to our existing impact assessment tools, and particularly at the early stages of project planning, to really understand where we need to have a special attention to gender issues and women issues. Thank you.
Great, Marta, thank you so much for talking about how you work and also the more specifics on the ground, because as you said, Frode, that's what it's all about, right? I'd like to turn it over to you now, Amalia, from Industri Energi.
Thank you. I work for the trade union, Industri Energi. Industri Energi is unique in the sense that we use 3% of all our membership dues on international and solidarity activities. We cooperate with Norwegian NGOs, with sister unions internationally, and we are affiliated to several global unions. Responsible business conduct is a priority for Industry Energy, and that is why we have contributed to SHE-Deal, and we hope it will improve the working conditions for women. As a trade union, our key priority is to organize workers. We believe that united workers can demand change, demand collective agreements, and take part in social dialogue. In our bilateral project, organizing young workers and women is one of the main goals. A priority of the international trade union movement is to campaign for the ratification of ILO Convention 190 on violence and harassment in the world of work. Women are disproportionately affected by violence and harassment at work. And according to the convention, employers are required to take measures and develop workplace policies in consultation with trade unions to prevent violence and harassment. It also obligates states to provide trade unions with resources and training on violence and harassment in the world of work, including gender-based violence. Industry Energy is encouraging the Norwegian government to ratify the convention. And we also want to include the convention in the global framework agreements we have, including the agreement with Equinor. Many Norwegian companies have not taken human rights and women's rights due diligence seriously. I've heard many excuses. It's too complicated, it's too expensive, etc. But SHE-Deal companies have a tool. I hope they will use this tool to promote gender equality and fight gender-based violence. But in order for that to happen, companies, they have to commit. Gender due diligence sounds complicated, but it's about everyday issues and asking questions about everyday issues. I hope the tool will be an eye-opener, a guide for companies to ask the right questions, ask the right people, and of course use the findings to promote gender equality. I have attended several women conferences organized by the global unions, and it strikes me that some of the problems raised at these conferences are so easy to fix. It's not complicated stuff. Take protective clothing. Companies have to ask themselves, do we provide protective gear that fit women? Female workers often have to wear overall designed for men, where there's no room for the curves. So a female worker has to choose. Should I wear a baggy overall that might compromise safety, or an overall which exposes the curves and might lead to sexual harassment? I have listened to South African female mine workers saying that they fear the overall will get stuck in the machineries, but they fear more that they will be raped if the overall is too tight. And I hope that SHE-Deal will help companies and also the unions ask the right questions. Issues that might look insignificant, like where the toilets are located, can be of great importance. Thank you.
Thank you, Amalia. And thank you for being so specific and showing what this is really about. The overalls and the PPE equipment simply not designed for women. And that might sound like something trivial, but actually in practice, it can have some pretty serious consequences. Thank you for that. Tulia, please.
Thank you, Ylva. So, Stuido, we are an investor. So how do we promote gender equality? Well, there are three main things that we do when we invest. And we divest from companies, we engage with companies, and we also rate companies. And gender equality, it's embedded in this, it's integrated in this. And we think that within these three activities, SHE-Deal can be also very useful for us. So when we divest from companies because they are involved in serious human rights violations. And here we're talking about the opposite of promoting gender equality. So it can be that women are discriminated on pay when they are going to be promoted. When they become pregnant, they might get fired, or they might not get the breaks that they need. They might be sexually harassed. So these are important problems that women faced. And we have exclusions for companies like this. One of them is Walmart. It's excluded from our investment among other reasons because of this. So for investors, it's extremely interesting to use this She-Deal tool, because when you see the She-Deal tool for a retailer, even though it's not specifically yet an example in the industries that She-Deal shows, you can see that, for example, Walmart sells food and it also sells clothes. So you can look at the garment and you can look at the food companies, and then you can see, okay, where is the risk? Because the risk is going to be different depending on the sectors. And we investors, we are not experts on everything. So it's a good guidance for us to know, okay, where is the risk? The risk is going to be with the workers. Whereas for a mining company, the risk might be more on the impact that the mining industry, the mining company might have on the local women and girls, for example. So the second thing that we do is that we engage with companies. So we vote at AGMs for shareholder resolutions promoting gender equality. Another thing that we do is that we talk to companies, and that what we experience is that often women are pretty much invisible. So if you don't ask the questions specifically about women, it's like you don't get the answer. So we were visiting a palm oil plantation and we asked about health and safety, and we were taken to the actual workers there, and we saw how the workers were harvesting the palm oil bunches, and it's very physical demanding work, right? So we ask, after a while I ask, okay, and where are the women? Well, the women, they do light work, you know. So, like, it's not a problem. I say, okay, but what do? Well, you know, sometimes they pick the loose fruit. Sometimes they are fumigating with pesticides. What you said. And I'm like, yeah, of course, being exposed to pesticide is not risky. So, but if you don't ask that question, and then it's the casual work too, because it's sometimes, right? So they don't have the same rights that maybe their co-workers are men. So here are issues that if we don't ask them, we don't get them. And that the She tool here also can help you to ask the right questions. And then the last thing we do is the rating of companies. So we rate companies based on gender equality. And that means that we give a score for the companies that are doing well. They get more invested in them. And the companies that are not doing that well in gender equality, they are not. And we also have a portfolio picking the best companies, so our clients can also invest directly on that. And we also have a fund that invests in women empowerment. So, yeah. And then we think that the She-Deal tool also could be very helpful here, because if it could be quantified somehow, like Frode is saying, the information is shared, then it could be also very useful and upscale for us, the investors, to really do a good analysis of all these companies. Now I know I'm going over time, so
Tulia, thank you. Thank you. I'd love to listen for another hour or so, but we need to move on a little. I think the two of you both pointed to the importance of asking the right questions to the right people, and you're also very specific on what's happening on the ground. And Amalie, if I could just dig in a little bit more into the example that you talked about with the overalls. Because I think in order to understand that and how human rights are being violated, you need to ask the right questions to the right people, right? And you've now been able to understand that risk and those problems. What can be done then to solve the problem? What's the next step when you see that these uniforms are the way they are? How can that be improved in your experience?
The way we solve it is to go through the shop steward, the union, and demand protective gear that fits. But sometimes the companies are not willing to provide it. They say it's too expensive or it's not available, and so on. But that's how we will raise an issue like that.
And does that work, do you find?
Some places, sometimes, but not all the time. Like this is also an issue which is raised in Norway by our young women in our union. They complain that they don't have protective gears if they get pregnant, for instance. It's not possible to find protective gear for them. So they either have to wear too big clothes or they will have to do other work.
Yeah. And I know, Marte, you pointed to She-Deal as being a good tool to really understand where do you need to put the attention, because there are probably so many things that you can do and can talk about and can address, but that She-Deal might help you zoom in on the important issues. So two questions on that. One is, what have you found to be the most important issues? And number two, have there been any surprises? You know, did you sort of think the most important issues were in one space, and then by using SheDeal you found them to be something else?
Now, we've been part of the development of SheDeal, so it's been a pilot work for us. So I would say that the tool has helped us to zoom in, definitely, to be concrete on a specific region, and also to have this structured approach to looking at the issue. And very often, you know, you think you know the issue, but it might be that you are wrong, or there are other issues that are higher on the agenda.
And have you been wrong somewhere? Have there been any surprises in
Well,
the pilot phase?
I don't think I would say that, but we constantly learn when it comes to where we have issues. And one example, we didn't use SheDeal in that specific case, but in Brazil, we've been working for quite some time to look at fishing communities. And very often you have to dig a bit deeper to find the real vulnerable people. And in the fishing community, in one of the areas in Brazil, the women aren't, as you also mentioned, they aren't kind of official workers. So you really have to find out the dynamics of that, and then when you find them, then of course you can try to help empower them. So I think, you know, you really have to dig deep, and you have to be systematic and kind of persistent in your approach. And I think SheDeal is a very structured and detailed tool, and I think it will probably also be developed going forward as we learn more about those specifics.
And Frode, you said that this is a necessary tool. It doesn't introduce anything new, but it's a new way of doing things, is how I read you. So could you share some reflections on what kind of issues do you think might be uncovered by using this that mightn't have been uncovered otherwise? You know, what will be the specific value of it in practice?
I think the value is mostly because it doesn't introduce something very new. I think, well, I haven't thought of any issues that that will come up with this tool, but it will put a sharper light on gender issues, and it will also help enhancing the work on addressing women's issues. And in the guidances and in the guidelines and in the guidances that the OECD has developed, there are several issues that will be key in this work, for instance, including women in stakeholder dialogues, so that you create safe arenas for dialogue with women, without men, if that's necessary, for instance. And
Would you like to have men, though, at least one in this context? So.
Men are different. so and there are other practical, and also to also one issue which is important, of course, and which also is addressed in the guidelines, is that it's need for collecting information about the specific risks, and this is a tool that will address the risks for women, and only doing that is a great step forward to single out that and use a tool especially for that, and that because that is the basis for all the actions that you take in order to address the risks that your businesses make.
Just one follow-up question to you, Frode, and I think all of you have touched on it. And I think Per also in this introduction, the challenge of women being in the informal sector often, or having informal jobs. So to what extent can we move forward on women's rights by including women more in the formal economy and taking them out of casual jobs? So really building companies that provide safe, formal employment. How does that fit into the picture?
I think we are now approaching a problem that is concerning, to a large extent, domestic law. I mean, businesses address these issues and do the right thing. But these are issues that I think mostly will be maybe dealt with local law, which is often then lacking and is insufficient in the local.
Maybe I was a bit unclear. I'm thinking more by investing like Norfund does. So investing in companies that become profitable and can grow and can employ people, also women. That's an important part of addressing women's rights, because then they no longer have to work as casual laborers.
Yeah.
So, and the same thing I think with Equinor and other companies, building formal, responsible supply chains in the markets they operate.
And there's also some additional, which OECD guidelines talk about, is one issue which is in the extension of that, is that when the new industry comes into society and more money comes into society, the roles and the systems may change, and that may affect women significantly, both in the working community and also at home. So being the breadwinner previously, then the man get employed and then gets the money and everything change. And then the businesses need to be aware of that and need to address it.
Business development can change those dynamics. We're all very aware, of course, of COVID and the implications that it has for us, literally standing here in a studio like this instead of at a conference. But also the effects are very clearly felt in developing countries. And we know this, 1/3 of jobs in developing countries are at risk. And we don't have the same kind of crisis packages that we're seeing in our part of the world. The life there is very different, not least for women, employed, unemployed, potentially unemployed. So Amalie, I wanted to turn to you and ask you about the implications and the impact of COVID in these markets and on women's rights. Could you share some reflections on that?
Yeah, in the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of people are saying that the virus didn't discriminate. But I think we can say that when we now have seen some of the effects of the measures that we took to reduce the spread of the virus, that it had a class and a gender division. 1 million garment workers in Bangladesh lost their jobs because the brands cancelled their orders. Most of these were women without formal working contracts, without any safety net or right to social benefits. We have, like in Hong Kong, when the curfew were introduced, domestic workers, they were not allowed to go outside on the day off, so they've been trapped with their employers. No way to go if they have been experienced harassment or sexual violence. Health workers in Swaziland, they've been harassed to and from work because people think they are infected and they're afraid of getting the virus themselves. In hospitals where there have been shortage of protective gear, doctors have been prioritized and nurses have been working without any protective gear. And in Australia, shop employees, they've been spit at and attacked because they asked customers to respect control measures. And from US, we hear that single mothers, they've been forced to resign their jobs because they had to stay at home with children when daycares and schools were closed down. So
basically what we're seeing is the COVID crisis is exacerbating the problem of violation of human rights. We're going to start to wrap up soon, but I know that you asked for the word, Marte, and then maybe Tulia as well. So,
no, I think just to support what was just said, that really understanding the new risks or the exacerbated risks related to new context, and of course the pandemic is such a new context, it's extremely important. And again, being very systematic in the approach to detect those issues. But as a part of the wrap-up, that's why I wanted to get the word. And I think, you know, a tool like SheDeal is extremely important, that we manage to make tools that are cross-sector for such an issue that is really cross-cutting. So I think it's really good if we can broaden such a tool so that it's not like for oil and gas or for garment sector. So that's very important. And also such tools, they serve a very important educational purpose. You know, really using it makes you aware about things you might have overlooked or haven't understood. So I think that is also extremely important. And lastly, adding those tools into a big company like Equinor's current processes is really the key to making it into use. Thank you.
And here you're pointing to a very important aspect, which I think goes to everything to do with sustainability and environmental, social and governance issues, which is if you do it on the side, as a specialized thing that doesn't really affect normal business operations, then it will never really have a true impact.
That's true.
So I think we'll start with you with the wrap-up, Tulia, and if you could both comment on what you'd like to comment on, but also share your brief thoughts on when you're looking at the human rights, especially the women's rights agenda, and what you think about going forward. What makes you hopeful? And what keeps you up at night? Perhaps starting with what keeps you up at night and then looking forward, what makes you most hopeful?
Okay, I'll just say as last thing, I think that for investors the most important thing here is that of course the SheDeal has to be implemented. we need to see the results on the right holders, also on the women. But so that communication part of the She deal is the most important, that companies like Equinor, other companies too, dare to publish the results of that due diligence. Is extremely important for us investors if we're going to have that conversation with the companies. Otherwise, we are not making progress. So that's part of it. So what doesn't make me sleep at night?
What keeps you up at night?
Keeps
What
up,
worries
okay,
you
yeah,
when it
what
comes to
worries me?
women's rights in...
Yeah, it's just going so slowly. So that gender gap, I mean, it's the general one is over 100 years to get equality, and the economic one is over 200 years. I mean, hope for my daughter, I don't know, you know, when I think about that. But what gives me hope is that we're here together, and there are so many, I'll talk for the investors. The investors are mobilizing, and we are, for a better word, pushing companies to do the right thing. So we hope that also this would help with gender equality. So, and of course, using She deal. So, yeah.
Great. I'll turn to Marte, and then Frode and Amalie, I'll give you the final word on this. What keeps you up at night, Marte, and what makes you hopeful for the future?
No, I think, I really have to second what was said here, because it really goes, it's just too slow with many of the issues, not only women issues, but a lot of issues around migrant labor and child labor, etc. So it's really disheartening to see how we are not able to take action. And I think this pandemic has shown that the world is able to take action if it kind of needs and wants. So I'm kind of also hopeful that this pandemic and other kind of changes in the society really urges us, businesses, NGOs, governments, to take the right actions now, because you see that it actually helps. And I think sustainability it's been on the rise for a while. It's continuing to be on the rise, and maybe even more important than ever. So that's great.
And COVID shows us, the response to COVID shows us it can be done.
Yes.
If we want to. Frode, what keeps you up at night and what makes you hopeful?
It's very hard to rate problems for other people. But what's one of the most serious problems, I think, that we have been working with the last years is modern slavery, which is also, to a large extent, a women and girls problem. And that has to be solved, and businesses have to be really aware of what, or how important or how serious that problem is. So that is one issue that I think need to be addressed and solved, which also is a serious women and girls issue. But things are happening. Positive things are happening, and big industry and big investor funds are being more concerned about human rights and in general, and then is addressing that. So that makes it possible to think that it's maybe developing in a positive way. But I think in general that we need some domestic legislation to solve it.
Amalie, your thoughts to wrap up?
Yeah, I think I mentioned lots of the things that can keep you up at night.
And maybe should keep you up at night.
And should keep us up at night. But I think I will answer more strategically and say that I'm disappointed that the Norwegian government is so slow when it comes to Convention 190. We were hoping that the Norwegian government would go forward and ratify. But at least we have 2 ratifications now by Venezuela and Fiji. So it's moving forward. So, that gives me hope.
Great. Before we really wrap up, I'd just like to give the word to Per Bondevik again, who will close off with some reflections and remarks. Before he does so, just thank you to all 4 of you for an engaging and insightful conversation. Thanks.
And I would like to say thank you to all 5 of you, actually. It was very interesting listening to you. It gives us hope. There's a lot of challenges going on, but as was mentioned, I think gathering actors from across sectors is the only way to move forward on this. We need business to take their responsibility, unions pushing, also inside the unions, investors to do their part, and also civil society organizations as press groups, as often the ones being closest to the most vulnerable, being it women or other groups, and also from the policy side, we need this to be pushed. I'm really grateful for those of you that have been persistent enough to keep with us all the time, in spite of some technical issues. The whole webinar will be available online in a short time. We will update you on that, and please feel free to share it. I was about to say wildly, but also widely. And this is a start. Now we have to start working. We're really looking forward to get more experiences from investors, unions, companies, civil societies in the use of this. We are really eager to understand how this can be a useful tool. What are the next steps we're about to take? And the only way to do that is to work on it together and discuss it. So then I wish us all the best in fighting for a better life for women workers globally. Thank you.
Okay.
Tusen takk.
Det kom, jeg hadde en teknisk sak, så folk ville ha startet. Jeg vil gjerne